All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day in 1929, the Permanent Apportionment Act is signed into law. That capped House membership at the level established after the 1910 census and created a procedure for automatically reapportioning House seats after every decennial census. But basically what it did was, since then, stuck the number of representatives in the House at 435, give or take a couple here or there. We'll get into that. But 435 members of Congress, each state generally having the same number of representatives going on almost 100 years now. And suffice it to say, the U.S. population has changed a lot since then, but not the number of representatives. So there are many, many ripple effects and controversies and interesting things to talk about and try and figure out why we have stayed at that number. So here to do that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody. Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is Philip Bump, national correspondent for The Washington Post, a writer who covers all sorts of great things in politics, but also does a newsletter I really like, How to Read This Chart, and has this wonky side of him that I really appreciate. So, Philip, thank you for doing this.
Thank you for appreciating my wonky side.
Yeah, well, if there's anyone who's going to do it.
That's right.
We'll get into the nitty-gritty of kind of how we arrived at this number of 435. But one thing that strikes me about this story, and Philip, maybe you have thoughts on this, but, this was a number that was changed and contested and sort of reformed a lot through the 19th century, and then something happens in the early 20th century where it just kind of stops dead in its tracks. And I wonder if you have thoughts about why 1929 was the year that seemingly we just kind of said, okay, that's it, no more reforms.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak specifically to 1929 as the year, but I certainly do think that there is a reflection in this of American politicians' increasing willingness to not have to fight over anything, right? No, I don't necessarily want to speak to, what the composition of the Congress was in 1929. I am not an historian, but look, no one in Congress likes to actually try and solve problems very much. I said very, very ungenerously, but I think it, to the extent that you can set something to the side and have it dealt with forever, Congress is always going to opt for that, I think.
Oh, for sure. And it's also one of those things that is particularly sticky because when you reapportion, some of those members of Congress are going to lose their districts, they're going to lose their seats. And so it's not just necessarily maybe bad for their state, but it is personally bad for them. So you see them behind the scenes lobbying their friends both in the House and in the Senate, where they have some pull to keep any kind of reapportionment from happening after the 1920 census.
Yeah, and as you think about how the country grows and expands in diversity and demographic and geographically, these numbers are constantly shifting. And so the battles would be endless if you think about the ways that the number of times that the country shifts, in its population and its geographics.
And in particular, the population shift that's happening, the 1920 census is so important for historians because it's the first year that the majority of the population no longer lives in rural areas, but in something that is at least the size of a town. And so this is when America becomes a more urban nation. And so you get that idea embedded in the debates over reapportionment. Yeah. So you have Edward Little of Kansas saying that a nation that began at Concord and Lexington might soon let her councils be dominated by semi-civilized foreign colonies in Boston, New York, and Chicago. Some good anti-immigrant sentiment there.
I know, right?
Concord and Lexington, by the way, are basically big cities at this point, so
right.
worth noting. But I mean, Philip, is that how you kind of read a lot of this? That it really does get to some of this very fundamental urban versus rural representation questions that are lingering to today?
Well, I mean, I think that's a great point about immigration, right? I mean, the fact that we're talking about this happening in this period of time when there had just been this massive backlash by Congress to try and crack down on the number of people who come to the United States. And that's where, you're seeing this growth. And, this is, I forget when Ellis Island closed, but this is close to the heyday, right? So, when we talk about this, all of these things in this massive backlash we saw 100 years ago in the United States against immigration, which of course overlapped with race and ethnicity being understood differently than it is now. Yeah, that makes sense, right? Are we going to give a lot more members of the House to these places in New York City where, if you go down the Lower East Side, you're not going to like what you're seeing, if you know what I'm saying, right? Like, are we going to give more people more House seats to folks like that? Or are we going to simply say, here's where we are and cut it off at that level? That's a great point that I hadn't thought of.
It's also interesting that the first time George Washington gets this bill, he vetoes it. And he vetoes it because he knows that this reapportionment will benefit northern states, which were largely become free states. But this political divide over slave states versus free states is also something that's heavily informing how people are thinking about these power structures.
So just one little tidbit on the level of reform, as we said, they were readjusting the number of seats fairly regularly, and there was a reapportionment in 1921 that would have brought it up to 483, and a bunch of members said, "Wait a minute, I'm going to lose my seat. I don't feel about this." But then, according to some of the reporting at the time, the House chamber did not have adequate seats for 483 members. I read that and I was like, oh wait, that's not euphemistic. There weren't enough seats. Like, there literally were not enough seats in the House chamber. And so, there you go. I felt to your point about laziness. You gotta subcontract someone to come in and put in some more seats.
It's a fair point, right? Like, every time there's one of these joint hearing, joint meetings in Congress, I always wonder, like, how do they do this? There's only 435 seats. Where do all the? But it's a fair point. Like, there is actually a hard cap. We have a Capitol building. What are you going to do?
Yeah,
right?
Fair enough.
You're going to move everyone into the rotunda? Like,
at a wing.
Yeah. Right? Just another floor on top. Sure, why not?
I think enough of those folks are conveniently on vacation or in local, that there's a good number of them absent at any given moment. But we can get to this. But that does bring up one point, which is kind of like one of the arguments against this is against increasing the number. It's just like, you think Congress is dysfunctional now, imagine 100 more people, and it's just like, well, yeah. But we could circle back around to that, I guess. But, in terms of the dynamics at play here, I mean, obviously the American population has both grown and shifted in some of the ways that we've hinted at here. Just to sort of give a number to that, the average number of people represented in a district has more than tripled since this bill in 1929, from about 210,000 to 760,000. But the cap is the cap. And so, as I can tell, states have a little power to sort of shift lines around within their state, but the basic number doesn't change. And that, I think, is where the real tension comes into play. The Supreme Court sort of mandates roughly equal districts within states, but not across states. So you end up, I don't know, what's the best example here, but you end up with a state like, I don't know, Wyoming. Do we want to pick on one Wyoming here? Go ahead.
A state like Wyoming, right, has one representative, and that representative represents about 500,000 people. A state like Delaware also has one representative that represents nearly 1 million people. So you have a kind of unequal representation that we've accepted in the Senate, but that we weren't supposed to have in the House. And that is probably not something that we can fix without adding more representatives.
Yeah. And of course, that's going to tip the balance if you're thinking along blue states and red states in terms of who gets more representation. It's always going to be the states that have bigger populations, and bigger populations also lead to more urban populations. And then, of course, you can see why people would be nervous about who gets what.
Honestly, the thing that struck me when we're having this conversation is the arbitrariness of the state lines themselves, right? Because when we think about who it is that, what's the point of a member of the House of Representatives? Right. We talk about there are 435 right now. Most Americans couldn't name their member of Congress, right? They could name their senators. I think it's probably safe to say most people could name both senators well before they could name their member of the House. In part, that's because the members of the House have no real vehicle anymore to actually make a name for themselves beyond social media trolling a la Madison Cawthorn, right? I mean, there's not a lot of things you can do to actually make a stamp with your constituency besides to be sort of the constituent service person, right? And so there's this difference between what a legislator is supposed to do to legislate and what they're supposed to do on behalf of their constituents that have different needs when you talk about how many legislators there should be, right? So when we talk about trying to pass laws, there's probably too many legislators, even at 435. It's like, they don't even have any say in anything. But when you talk about actually delivering for people, then there aren't enough, because you should really be able to have, just a couple 100,000 people, maybe tops, that you can actually get a response from. And so when we talk about something like Delaware, right? Why can't Delaware share a legislator with Maryland, right? I mean, like, why not do that beyond, the Constitution and rules, things along those lines. But I mean, it makes sense. Like, why don't we explore ways in which we can increase the ability of people to be heard and represented by limiting that disparity that we just talked about? Since the goal here, anyway, the thing that's really useful to people is that sort of legislative services aspect of the job.
And so this logjam had been in existence for almost 10 years. We were about to face another census and another required reapportionment, and Congress hadn't changed. They weren't about to give up their power any more than they had been willing to 10 years earlier. And so Herbert Hoover comes into office in 1929 and basically is like, look, this isn't going to work. We're going to have to fix this somehow. And he puts forward this plan to cap the number at 435 and to make it not only automatic, but to make the president in charge of making sure reapportionment happens every 10 years. And so not only do you have an automatic process put into place, but you actually have Congress handing over some of its power to the president, which is something that is going to happen a fair number of times during the 20th century.
But is there something there also about kind of an expectation that we'll do a little reform now and then there will be more reform and we'll revisit this? I mean, most people think that, we'll get back to this every 10 years or so,
Yes, kicking the can down the road seems to be the mode of operatus.
Or I guess the more generous interpretation is kind of like, if you start doing something, then surely other people will pick up the mantle of reform. I think we're having a lot of those conversations now about, like, do you hold out for the big sweeping thing, or do you take what you can get with a hope that, often a dashed hope, that, more reform will follow? We should say that occasionally you do get seats added or removed or moved around. We added Alaska and Hawaii, and then just this last year, it was California lost the seat for the first time, and Texas gained two. I think New York lost one. So every once in a while there's a few that shift around here or there. When you're talking about within as big a number as 435, Philip, do you think that stuff actually matters or makes has an effect on how our government works?
When we talk about 435, it is rare that it makes that big a difference. But when we look at the House now, for example, we talk about how the Democrats have controlled the House and Senate, barely. And actually, if you look at the percentages, there was a period in time where if you included Kamala Harris's vote in the Senate, then the percentage margin in the House is actually narrower for the Democrats than it was in the Senate, just by virtue of the fact that there's so many people. So when you add one or two seats, that can make a big difference. So, I mean, there's been a lot of conversation about the fact that New York just barely, what was it? A few thousand people made the difference between having a seat and not having a seat over the course of the last apportionment cycle. Who knows? You never know when it's going to make a big difference on legislation. And I think all Americans would absolutely root for a really, really closely divided House. So there's lots of fights that are happening there because we don't get enough of that in our daily lives.
That's right. More closely divided government. I think that's what everyone's calling for.
I just can't imagine having, if every district were the size of Wyoming, there would be 574 seats based on the 2020 census, which to me is like 574. What? Like, I mean, that's mind-boggling. So no, I don't think we're going to get a proper solution anytime soon. No.
So, Philip, do you have thoughts on kind of just in general? We hinted at it at the beginning, but just like this idea of stagnation and kind of the lack of reform, and I guess now, we've talked about it on this show a little bit, but it does feel a little bit like we're in a moment we're sort of looking at the gears of democracy a little bit again. I mean, do you feel like we're revisiting any of these questions in any sort of serious way?
Yes. Do I feel like we're addressing any serious question in a serious way in Congress is the question you asked.
Rephrase my question that way.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are obviously real questions that are percolating at the moment about the link between Americans and their representation, right? In the Senate and the Electoral College in particular. I think the House less so. I think one of the things that's sort of under-recognized, though, is as we're talking about what had happened in the House over the course of the past few cycles, people sort of under-recognize that we're at the tail end of a census apportionment cycle. And so, so some of the weirdness that we saw in terms of representation that had emerged recently was simply a function they hadn't sort of rejiggered the numbers again after the most recent census. So now, of course, we're going to see a whole new House that comes up here in the next cycle. And perhaps that will prompt more of this conversation. But look, I think at the end of the day, if people had to rank, if people were concerned about these things, had to rank, what you're going to change, House is at best third on the list.
I mean, there are fights for, adding representation for parts of the country that don't have real representatives. But in terms of reforming the numbers and how the counting is done, I don't think that's very high on the list.
Yeah, I was about to say, it's like judiciary, electoral college, and the president, then the Senate and the filibuster, and then maybe, if we have time left over, someone will get around to the House. But it's pretty low man on the totem pole in this reform conversation.
I've heard a lot more people say, hey, we need to abolish the Senate than I have, we need to abolish the House.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, it's just, and I can attest to this, apportionment is just a really tough word to say over and over and over, and it's just not going to stick. No one's going to pick up the mantle of a 5-syllable,
it needs a rebrand.
4-syllable word. It needs a rebrand. Yeah.
We need an acronym.
All right. Well, Philip Bump, this has been really fun, and you're going to be around for our next episode too, which is going to be less wonky, a little weirder. But thank you for joining us here, and we will see you next episode.
Yeah.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. We can only make the show with your support. If you want to support the show and the network, you can do it at thisdaypod.org. Also on our website, you can sign up for our newsletter. You can also see transcripts of the show. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kala Nakua helps with transcripts and the newsletter. Thanks to Julie Shapiro and Audrey Martovich, executive producers at Radiotopia. Thanks to the whole team at Radiotopia and PRX. If you have any questions or comments or ideas about the show, get in touch, thisdaypod@gmail.com, or find us on social media at thisdaypod. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.